Welcome to Darshan Talks, powered by the Kulkarni law firm. This podcast explores the challenges and opportunities facing FDA-regulated companies. Join us as we discuss the latest trends, news, and insights with experts and executives in the field.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Darshan Talks. I'm here with the perennially popular Krishna Jani, and I've had Krishna on multiple times, as you guys may remember. She is the privacy guru. She is the person we talk to when we are discussing what are the ramifications associated with privacy, because it's privacy simple. There's really nothing going on in that space. It's so boring. I think if you learned it in 1980, nothing would have changed. So we're going to take a special lens today, which is if you were a life sciences company, whether a drug company, a device company, a food company, and you were in a situation where you were looking to merge with another company, or you were looking to buy out another company, or another company was looking to buy you out. What are some privacy implications? How does a Krishna Jani come to the question and go, look, this is the team, but we have some privacy issues we need to think about, to consider. So Krishna, I'm going to let you take it from here, but I want you to think about and point us to how you would approach the problem. So who would you start with? Would you start with the buyer, the seller? What do you think about? And I'll let you kind of take it from here.
Sure. Well, Darshan, first of all, thank you for having me. For those who don't know, my name is Krishna Jani, and I am an attorney at the law firm of Flaster Greenberg here in Philly. I'm based in the Conshohocken office now. And my practice focuses primarily on cybersecurity and data privacy, as Darshan said. Super boring field, nothing going on. Jokes. So interesting. I love it. As well as intellectual property and litigation. So in full disclosure, I am not an M&A attorney or corporate attorney, but because Flaster is full service, of course, I have been roped into plenty of corporate matters, including some due diligence for an M&A transaction. So with that sort of background and caveat in mind, I think it depends, is my sort of disclaimer. First, it depends. And because in my role as a private practice attorney, it depends which client has retained us and for what purpose. So if we are assisting, in the case that I'm thinking about, we were retained by not a life sciences company, and we do a lot of work with life sciences companies, but in this case, I'm thinking about a media company, for example, that retained us for an acquisition of a small part of another company. And so that framework is important because we were retained not by the purchased or the sort of at the target. We were retained by the purchaser, a pre-existing client that we had long-standing relationship with. So we knew their business. That's important. You want to think about what their business is. Are they a life sciences company that does clinical trials for big pharma companies? Is it a big pharma company? Is it a consultancy? Where are they based? You really want to understand the business of your client. And that can depend on a series of factors.
But why does whether it's a pharma company matter? Isn't a purchaser a purchaser?
Can you explain the question?
Yeah, I'm trying to help you sort of clarify that a little bit that you pointed out that, who is the client matters.
Sure. Yes.
So why does it matter? Like I'm thinking about when I face my average client, they always think every deal is a template deal. And they think that it doesn't matter what I am. I just want to buy this company. So all you need to do is tell me that this company is okay. Why are you looking at me? So talk to me about why you're looking at me.
No, absolutely. So the purchaser, of course, your client, assuming that in this instance is the purchaser, that matters because the company is going to be subject, even the purchaser, to certain laws, right? If you're a pharmacy company, you may be subject to HIPAA, depending on the nature of data you collect, you deal with. You may be subject to FDA regulations. You probably are. You may be subject to local state laws. As we know now, almost 6, definitely 5 states have comprehensive consumer privacy laws. All 50 states have data breach notification laws. So there's a lot to consider just as sort of a threshold analysis as to what laws you may be subject to. Even if you're not the asset, that the target being acquired, that you are the purchaser, because you've got considerations too as your business takes on new data and potentially, this is the crux, right? Shares data with another party outside your organization. That's why it matters.
So what you're talking about is before you even start looking at what you're purchasing, you might want to consider doing a self-audit to figure out where you are.
That's a great way to put it. I think a self-audit is the way to go. I think a lot of times before even getting to an M&A transaction, what companies are just starting to do, which is awesome, as they hire more in-house counsel that are privacy specialists, that they work with consultancies, they are looking to data map. And I think a lot of companies haven't endeavored to do this yet. But if you haven't, that self-audit is almost a necessary step before I think you even get to preparations for an M&A deal, because you want to understand what data you have, who has access to it. Again, what laws you're subject to that are going to govern how you manage, how you collect, store, manage, and share, if you're permitted to, that data. You have a whole different set of regulations in the EU with the General Data Protection Regulation that is far more comprehensive than what we've got here in the States. But in some ways is a lot stricter with regard to how you share that data. Of course, European companies have long baked into their corporate culture this element of privacy. You used to have the Data Privacy Directive that's sort of morphed into this larger and more comprehensive regulation. And it's a part of European culture in a way that I think it's just starting to become part of our vernacular here in the States. But that's definitely, I would absolutely advise a self-audit before even engaging in deal talks.
And yet, I can tell you I'm working on a deal right now where we have a client saying, oh, you think we'll be able to finish all of this by, I don't know, early May. And you're kind of going, that seems tight. That seems, so that's tight, assuming everything went perfectly. So,
right.
So the question I have is, while I hear what you're saying, as a client, how often do you get resistance saying, that's not the job I'm hiring you for? I want to know if I can buy this company. So how do you deal with that initial resistance? I mean, what you're talking about is sort of that creating a data, like you said, you create this data map, you know where your data is flowing, and then you can see how these inputs can connect to the outputs from the company being acquired, which is awesome, which is really where the standard should be. But reality is you don't have the time to do that. Reality is clients push back. So what do you do at that point? Is there like a bare minimum you can do? Or do you just go, look, as a client, you're welcome to take whatever risk you want. This is what I'm suggesting should be your first step. But if you decide to skip this part, we can do it post-closing as well.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think, again, it depends on the nature of the transaction, whether it's an acquisition of an entire company, part of a company, whether it's a merger and you're really sort of taking processes and data of two companies and trying to operationalize something that works for both parties. That's a whole different consideration. And we could talk about that for probably hours. But what I'd advise, I think it's important also to maybe take a step back here and look at the life cycle of an M&A transaction, right? As an attorney, I want to be notified like a month before you even think about having discussions that you're going to engage in an M&A deal. Now, does that often happen? No, we are engaged at any given time of the life cycle, right? First, you've got maybe what you can call preparations, right? That a company is looking to potentially make a sale, make a purchase, merge with another company for any given reason. Maybe they want to acquire a part of a market that they don't currently have. They want to sell a certain drug that they don't currently have. They are looking at a small lab that has already created the technology they need to produce the drug, whatever it might be. So you want to look at the preparations, right? What sort of talk to them in this stage, if you can. Then you've got sort of this pre-transaction discussions about what, maybe the purchasor, in this instance, that's my client, has narrowed down 2 or 3 potential targets that they're looking for. That is when you can really get into the analysis. Okay, if you're looking at these 3 companies, given their size, their scope, the nature of their business, this is where I'd come in with, here is what I think as a broad overview of what the privacy assessment can look like. And if the client pushes back and says, this is not part of a pre-due diligence discussion, I'd say it is, because not only is it going to come up during due diligence when you sort of review all these documents that are going to govern your responsibilities, your rights, and your legal risk, you want to sort of, if you can, foreshadow that a little bit, because you have the information about the target assets, you should, right? To at least put them on notice that this could come up. If this is going to be a problem for you, be mindful that this may impact the deal, right? Of course, it's not closed till it's closed, and you don't want to spend all this time and energy on a deal that's not going to go anywhere because it presents certain risks for you. So there's that. Let's say that this drug in this example I gave hasn't cleared the FDA, right? Then you're maybe acquiring an asset that is going to be subject to all these sorts of hurdles before you can even put it on the market. Let's say it is engaged in an IP licensing sort of dispute with another company that says, hey, we came up with this first, what the heck? That could tie up your business. And so there's all sorts of legal risks that, including privacy and cybersecurity, that come in at the forefront. And even thinking about like logistics, right? There's not only the business itself, and I'll pause for follow-up. I'm sort of rambling here, but there's not only the business itself, there's also sort of logistics. It used to be, and forgive me, this is before my time because of course we do everything online now, but it used to be that you go into a room, you've got boxes of documents and you do your due diligence in person. Now, when you're looking at the sort of the life cycle of an M&A deal, everyone's in remote offices, people work from home. And so obviously we've got virtual due diligence rooms where you have this sort of cloud-based platform where you store all this information, and that's really important too as a process. What I would advise even before that stage is like, listen, before you get to this place where you're going to share all these documents, let's set up a secure room for you to do it. Let's make sure we send a password in one email and the link to the actual platform in another. Let's make sure we've got a vendor agreement with this third party that we're all going to be giving access to. Let's make sure we input user agreements. So the folks who are going to be accessing this data, are using secure Wi-Fi to do so. We're not sharing their passwords with other folks at their firm because we want to implement proper access controls. So even logistically, I would say to the company, it's important to consider this if you want your deal to go smoothly, especially considering in many of these deals, you're dealing not only with perhaps products that have not been on the market yet, but trade secrets, specific patents at play that you really don't want to get out or to even just be accessed accidentally by folks who don't need access, because that can create legal risk too.
I love that you sort of gave this overarching, almost the operational components of mechanizing the deal. I don't know if that's even a real word, mechanizing a deal, but I love that part. Perfect. So now you've got a situation. So saying we are going to consider this company. We have now data mapped because we are an amazing company. We are ahead of the curve. We had retained Krishna 3 years ago, so she has been working with us. She understands our inputs. She understands our outputs. She understands the goals of our company. Now, what do you look at?
So now I think it's the due diligence. So now I think once you've got all that in place, you really have to sit down and look at the contracts in place. You've got to look at the shareholders agreement. You've got to look at the company's privacy policies. You've got to analyze, depending on the jurisdictions in which you're in, what laws you may be subject to, and importantly, the type of data you collect, store, maintain, and will be shared. I mean, theoretically, if it's sort of a merger and you're merging two huge companies, you're likely going to be sharing all of that data. And most privacy policies, at least in my experience, do allow for that sort of sharing in the event an M&A transaction's underway. But I still think it's really important to make sure you've got the right confidentiality and provisions in play until the deal is closed. Because obviously deals fall through all the time, and that can create some liability if you're not careful about sharing prior to that sort of signing, seal delivered phase of the M&A deal. So that I think is probably one of the most time-consuming processes. So if a company's coming to you in late March, say, can we get this set in May? Depending on the size and scope of the deal, that might be difficult just because you want to make sure you do a thorough due diligence review of these contracts. And this is where, as legal counsel, my job would be to flag any risks I see, any red flags, any inconsistencies. Like, let's say the business is this sort of new part of the market that my client, the purchaser, has not yet endeavored to create on their own. They might not have the processes in place to store the data in a way that's effective for this new business, or to they might not have the right staff, the right training. They might have their privacy policy is probably not going to be congruent with this other company's privacy policy. So you really have to sort of point out all those inconsistencies and provide at least an outline of how they can be merged, how the company's values can be merged as it comes to privacy and cybersecurity, and what it has to do legally to comply with laws that are going to apply to it now that it has this new market share or this new business under its wing.
We have a lot more to discuss, but just wanted to give a quick reminder that this podcast is powered by the Kulkarni Law Firm, making compliance easier. Visit us at kulkarnilawfirm.com. Now, back to our conversation.
So what you've done, Krishna, is you've pointed out this sort of universe of stuff that could be areas of incompatibility. And having done several different M&A deals and I'm thinking, I think just based on the universe of stuff that can happen, let's try to narrow it down. Let's make this more of a case study than a what could, like, all the permutations and combinations, because there are so many permutations and combinations.
Yep.
Let's assume this is a large company acquiring a small company. Let's assume the small company is, I'm making up a number here, $20 million. So we know that this company is basically, it's just got its act together in terms of what the product looks like. It's probably got some initial sales going, but that's kind of sort of where it is. And let's assume it's a medical device company, mostly because if you're a drug company, you're probably worth way more than $20 million if you have something on the market. So let's take that as the initial framework. So that lets you do this initial thought process and analysis. The reason I say that is I want to look at this list you just gave of things you'd consider and poke at it a little bit in the context of I know that I will go point out these risks to my client and go, look, these are the things they have concerns with. These are issues that need to be fixed. These are incompatibilities. And what my client typically wants to know is what is a deal killer? What is something that can be fixed after the deal? And what is something that I can live with? So from that perspective, I'm thinking of, like, say, the privacy policy, and they're let's say they're incompatible, or more likely in a $20 million company, I would not expect them to even have a privacy policy. They probably took something, just threw on their website and hoped and prayed that it's working out. And let's be honest, I've seen way more of those than probably should. But
that breaks my heart.
So if that's the scenario, do you just kind of go, not a deal killer, this is something we can fix after the fact? Because let's be honest, if you're I'm making up numbers here, $1 billion company buying a $20 million company, you're going to dictate the terms. You're going to buy the whole thing out and you're going to dictate the terms. In that scenario, what are those elements that you're looking at and going, these are elements that are unfixable. These are the elements that are fixable but can be done after the fact. These are the elements that must be done before the fact so that this deal can go through. So can you help me break that down a little bit?
Sure. So I think I'd start the analysis with the applicable laws, because that's going to dictate everything else, right? So I think I'd first start with an international perspective. Is the purchaser, the target company, our client here, is this an international company? Where are they based, right?
Let's assume it is and I'm picking this on purpose, a Virginia-based company or a California-based company.
Perfect. Okay, so for the watchers of your show, you probably know that both Virginia and California have comprehensive data privacy laws. California has now got the California Consumer Privacy Act as amended by the California Privacy Rights Act, and that is now in full effect as of January 2023. Virginia's law is also in full effect, I believe, now after January 2023, the Virginia Data Privacy Act, VD's Consumer Data Privacy Act, and they also have revenue thresholds. So the smaller company probably wasn't previously, I know for a fact it was not previously subject to the CCPA, right? They have below 25 million, and they may not be, it sounds like a medical device company. Actually, who knows? Maybe they were, maybe they weren't, but it depends on what data they were collecting. If they were collecting data of something, I don't know that exact number, however many individuals or households.
I think is the usual cutoff, but yeah.
Usual cutoff. So that might be true. So if the medical device company is collecting data of more than something like 45,000, right, households or individuals, and they're storing that data, perhaps selling that data, then that is something now this acquiring company has to consider. That means that in the States, of course, right, looking at international laws, maybe they don't apply yet. That's fine. For the bigger company, they probably got all the systems in place to comply with the GDPR, Brazil's new law, Australia's, India's, all these different companies. Let's say that that's all in place for the parent company, what will be the parent company, the purchaser. Now they've got to make sure those processes are in place for the purchasee, the target. So let's say the target company, the small $20 million medical device company, outsourced its IT. They didn't have an in-house IT team. So they have this policy that's they generated from some nonsense AI bot that does not apply to their company, that does not sort of speak to this sort of reselling of information to third-party advertisers, let's say. Okay, so there's that. Then let's say that they don't have an in-house IT team, so they sort of contract out with this other company. They don't have a vendor agreement in place. So now what I'd say to the bigger company is, this is not a deal killer. I don't think this is a deal killer, but I think it's definitely something that you want to get you want to sort of like figure out how problematic it is, and then propose a solution. So I don't think that's super problematic, assuming the IT team has a good relationship with them and they've got, administrative, procedural, and technical safeguards in place. That's sort of the standard. Who knows if they're subject to HIPAA based on what they do. But if you're dealing with medical information, I generally advise that is the baseline, and you want to sort of look to NIST security standards and other security standards to meet that baseline. Because if you got pseudonymized data or anonymized data, maybe it's not a huge risk. But if you're collecting data of individuals coming to your site, you've got this privacy policy that's not all that robust, and then you're selling data, you're really looking now to different sorts of laws targeting data brokers apart from this sort of, HIPAA compliance medical data world. That's two different considerations. So I'd say first things first, let's talk to the company about what the relationship is with this IT team. Let's see what their cybersecurity looks like. Let's make sure we can bring them into our privacy policy and they're okay with the changes we're going to make to their business model, right? So that means that they're going to have to implement consent mechanisms for some of this data that they're collecting and then selling. That might affect their revenue share. But they're working underneath our wing now. So perhaps for them, that's not a deal killer either, because now they've got these greater resources, this in-house tech team, and just more considerations that we've already built into our global privacy framework. So that's an example of where I don't think these are deal killers, but if the smaller company is not all that robust in its cybersecurity and privacy program, if it's not built out a privacy by design policy, if it does not pseudonymize its data, that's a red flag. That's something that if they're collecting medical information in this context, I think you just don't need individual information. And the whole point of data minimization as a fair information privacy principle is that if you don't need it, don't collect it. If you don't need it, don't store it. So if a company was reckless with its information, I might consider that to be a huge red flag. That might be a data kill if they're not willing to change their practices. Now, if they do have pseudonymized data, if they're sort of working within the scope of their business, collecting this data for the purpose of building out medical devices, getting consumer feedback, and so forth, that's all fine. But then if they have this separate arm with this web presence, this consumer-facing website that's collecting and sharing data just to supplement that income, that's where I'd say if you're not willing to change that, red flag. But they should be in this context. A multi-billion-dollar company is looking to buy you out. Maybe you don't need that revenue share anymore, or perhaps knowing that you've got to comply to avoid liability under laws like California and Virginia, especially California. Because as most of California's now got a new agency, the CPPA, the California Privacy Protection Agency, which is tasked specifically with enforcing against CCPA violations. Virginia's and all the other states, to my knowledge so far, are still using their Attorney General's office to enforce against privacy violations, which is all great. But practically speaking, sometimes when companies push back, and they're my clients, and they're smaller companies, they say, we understand this is the law, but what's the risk that we're going to get dinged for this? And I say, listen, if you're operating in California, the risk is now perhaps pretty high. It's very easy to report on their website, for consumers to report on the CPPA website that there is a violation. It may be as easy in other states to report, but may not be as top of mind or as high priority to enforce, given the resources of the state. So if they're subject to the threshold now, the CCPA under the wing of this other company, that's something they really want to consider.
So
that's a lot.
That's a lot, but that's really good. It shows all these different considerations, and it shows why you need all the coffee you're drinking as we speak.
At this point, this could be a pill.
By the way, it is a pill. Caffeine pills you can get. So
no, not the same. It's not the same.
No, okay, fair enough. But let's take that for a second. So one of the things I get from clients when I talk to them is, well, I'm a pharmaceutical company. Am I subject to CPRA or CCPA, or am I subject to CMEA, which is for the medical information? How do you explain the difference to them to start off with? And how do you connect that to, say, a HIPAA to figure out when it applies to them and when it doesn't? So can you help guide through that process a little bit?
Yeah, I think it depends, again, on a series of factors. It's entirely possible, by the way, to be subject to many of them at the same time. I think that's what the patchwork framework in our country really is, I think, difficult for some companies to navigate for that very reason. It's entirely possible to be subject, of course, to HIPAA and the CCPA at the same time. HIPAA being a federal law that is sector specific, applying specifically to businesses that deal with PHI or protected health information, thinking, of course, of providers and their business associates. So looking at medical practices and the like, and then the people they contract with to help them with their business. So you've got the HIPAA. That applies largely, I think, to, of course, providers and their business associates. Now, the gap is if you're a big pharma company, well, maybe big pharma, it depends, I think, on how they interact with individuals, really, is the crux. If they're providing services to individuals, then I think HIPAA could apply. Or if they have, it depends, I think, on their corporate structure too. If there's a certain corporate arm that deals with patients or conducts clinical research in certain settings, that might be applicable. The CCPA is jurisdiction specific, right? So if you're dealing with the data of California residents, that's what you want to be mindful of. And most businesses in the States, California is such a big economy. It's geographically very large. It's got a lot of innovation coming out of places, of course, like Silicon Valley, and really all over. So you want to be mindful that there's sort of different analyses to see whether you're subject to each. And in this country, you're absolutely subject to HIPAA if you're a provider, a covered entity under HIPAA, or your business associate, but you can also be subject to the CCPA. Now, I'll be candid, I am less familiar with the CMEA, so I'd welcome your thoughts on that. I haven't worked with that personally, and I'm not barred in California, so that's something that I welcome your thoughts on.
Fair enough. So generally speaking, my experience with CME tends to be, it's sort of like the California equivalent of HIPAA, in that if it's medical information, we're going to hold you responsible. In fact, I believe CCPA has an exception saying not except for medical information. Right. So people think that, oh, good, I'm safe because it's not subject to CCPA. And then you find out CMEA exists and you're like, oh, wait a second, I have all this new crap I have to deal with. So that's generally how I find out what it means. But what I kind of wanted to get into was two more areas, and this is one of the downsides of opening Pandora's box like we have, because there's so much here. You use the term anonymization and pseudo-anonymization. What do those two terms mean? And I'll let you do that answer, and then we'll go to the next question I have.
Okay, so both of them are defined in various statutes. So that's I'm trying to look up exactly how the CCPA defines it. Maybe that's a better.
Well, generally speaking, at a practical level, what does that actually mean?
So anonymization is, of course, like you want to anonymize the data so that it's not traceable to an identified or identifiable individual. And then pseudonymization, as I understand it, is basically removing enough of, and correct me if I'm wrong, enough of the factors or the identifiers that's very, very difficult to sort of put the pieces back together and trace an identifiable or identified individual. And so oftentimes this is done, as you know, in the medical context, because you need maybe factors like the gender of an individual for a clinical study, the age of an individual. If you're looking at factors such as pollution, access to certain natural resources, maybe geographic location is important to know. But depending on, let's say it's a clinical study, depending on the sort of control of the clinical study or what they're looking to find, right? Then you don't need the person's name. Perhaps you don't need the person's age in certain circumstances if you're looking just to compare gender or perhaps nationality or geographic location. So you take the factors you need and you omit the rest. That's the point.
And the reason I asked that question is because I used to work in an organization that did a lot of the pseudo-anonymization. And one of the things that the technologists would always come back to me with is, your pseudo-anonymization is garbage for the most part. And the reason it's garbage is because it's so easy to identify someone once you have, I think it's like 3 data points.
Exactly. Yeah. That's true. I don't know if you've read the book Cyber Privacy by April Falcon-Doss, but it's a really good book. So I highly recommend it. And don't quote me on this, but I think she has a background in cybersecurity with the government. It might be the NSA. I don't know. She's sort of a government attorney by trade, or cybersecurity specialist by trade. And she cites this at the beginning of her book and says, listen, it is getting harder and harder to anonymize data, especially when you're transacting online. Now, I don't know if that's good or bad for our purposes, because I think that we can easily point that out to our clients. Hey, this is a risk. But how to effectively solve that risk if you need access to that data for the purpose of the clinical trial or for the purpose of maintaining client profiles, for covered entities or even non-covered entities, for an app, let's say, that's not subject to HIPAA, but that very well could be subject to CCPA. And the reason I didn't exempt medical companies dealing in medical information from the CCPA is because now when we look at consumer privacy law, we're not just looking at sort of what the crux of the business is. So the crux of a big pharma company, of course, is to provide medication That's great, but they're not a nonprofit. They're looking to make profit, to get more customers, to get more eyes on their products. And so a lot of the new data privacy laws, as we know, are focused on data brokers and companies that function, at least in part, like data brokers. So if this big pharma company that deals in medical data is otherwise exempt from the CCPA, but has, meets the threshold requirements for collecting a certain amount of information or the revenue threshold, and they've got a consumer-facing website that uses, cookies, of course, pixels, and other sorts of tracking technology, then they are likely subject to the CCPA because that is what the law is meant to focus on. So if one part of their business is this consumer-facing site that's meant to attract and target and retain new customers, that even if that's separate from the crux of their business, which is to provide this pill, they are likely still subject to the CCPA, I'd argue. And they cannot be exempt just because they're CMEA liable as well, I'd say.
I love it. I was really hoping, so as you know, I try to keep these at about 25 minutes or so, and we're well past that at this point. I really wanted to bring in the good RX and the better health discussion to add another layer to that, but it sounds like it's a conversation for another time. But for those who are listening, we're gonna have Krishna back on if she's willing to come back on, and we're gonna talk a little bit about how the FTC has recently become far more active than they have been in the past, and how that's changing the data privacy and cybersecurity landscape. And we'll discuss that as we continue. But Krishna, any parting words to our client, the big pharma company that's trying to acquire these companies?
Yeah. So one of the things you said to me at the beginning of the conversation is assume they push back and say privacy is not a part of the conversation. I always say this to our clients. It's rare that a big company like this would push back, but if a smaller company pushes back and says, look, we don't want to deal. This is not part of the discussion at this time. I usually push back again and say, if it's not part of the discussion at this time, it will be very soon, and it's going to be a harder conversation to have. So don't avoid it at the outset, because I think it's the best way to mitigate risk, is what I'd say.
I love it. Thank you again, Krishna. Krishna, just before we go, how can people reach you?
You can reach me by going to the Flaster Greenberg website. I have my attorney profile on there. I'm also co-chair of the Pennsylvania Bar Association Cybersecurity and Data Privacy Committee. You can reach me there. And lastly, you can find me on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Thank you again, Krishna.
Thanks, Darshan, for having me. Look forward.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Darshan Talks. Remember, the information we discuss is for educational purposes only and is not legal advice. For additional valuable insights and updates, be sure to subscribe to our newsletter at DarshanTalks.com. Darshan Talks